Hi, Suman.
Hi Divya.
How are you doing?
How you? I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Awesome.
Super.
And hi, Kanchan. Thanks for joining us. Suman, do we want to get started? And let maybe get started with answering the question, each of us, right? So, what do you think? Are you comfortable with silence?
So is that a question for me?
Yes, yes. I want to start off with before you start off with why this topic. Maybe I know for a fact that I'm not. I try to fill in what I consider as awkward gaps. So I'm curious
Yeah.
to know, Suman, how are you with silence? Are you comfortable?
Can still get uncomfortable, but I'm trying to get better at it.
And so tell us then why this topic. What made you think of this topic?
So it's very interesting, and I think it's very important also, right? So to your first question, am I comfortable? So picture this: says you're in the elevator, you are the only person, right? And it's going down, and it stops on one particular floor, and a stranger gets in, right? So what would you typically do? I mean, if you're like me, you kind of feel a little awkward. You go to the side, you pull out your phone, and you check your messages. Right? It feels uncomfortable, and I think it's because of the silence, right? Because you know that you're not going to speak.
Absolutely.
So I think this is true for everyone, and silence is again at many levels, right? It's at one level, it's about keeping our mouth shut, but it's also about keeping our mind silent. It's also about being mindful, right? So I think today let's just focus on the first one. I think we are talking about being comfortable with silence during conversations.
Correct. And why is it so important, Suman? Why is it important to be comfortable with silence during conversations?
So we do this as part of a listening quiz, which we administer in the workshops. And it's a very interesting quiz, and I firstly tell people that you have to be brutally honest. I mean, answer as to what you typically do as opposed to what you should be doing. One of the questions in that is, I feel comfortable with silence during conversations. And it's a 5 point scale ranging from not at all to very often. Now, what happens is quite a few people raise their hands and saying they're not comfortable. And it goes to the core of communication. I think the speaker and listener both need to be comfortable with silence. Speaker uses the silence to ensure that they create a space for others to come in. Hasn't it happened with us that let's say you're listening and somebody is saying something and you're trying to say something, you're trying to respond, but there is no gap, right? The person is just keep on speaking without a gap. It's relentless. By
Ab-
the way, what also happens is you have stopped listening after a while because you're now
Absolutely.
just trying to find a gap to get in, right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's important when we are speaking is to sometimes take a break, stop speaking, wait for the message to trickle in, to sink into the other person. There's a beautiful quote by George Bernard Shaw. He said, "The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place." And I think it'll be helpful for all of us to remember that because, when we are speaking, we think our job is done by just saying it, but has it really been understood on the other side? It helps us to check for understanding. Sometimes just take a pause, let the message sink in, and then check for understanding. So I think from all these aspects, I think it's important.
That is very, very nice, Suman. I love that quote. I took a bite of what you said about, assuming that communication has happened just because you said your piece. I think that's lovely. And it's such a apt title for all the circles here, right, Suman? Because there's so much of speaking, listening, moderating, kind of judging, silences, filling in the gaps, so much of that going on in the circle. So very, very cool topic. Before we
Right.
dive more into it, there is Prakash and Badal. Welcome to the panel. We'll just very shortly come around and kind of take your views as well, right?
Thank you.
Hi, yeah.
Thank
Suman,
you.
Yeah, sure, Prakash. And can you, if we could be on mute when each of us is talking, that would be great, right? So Suman, this kind of also is very close to something we were talking about, which is even in meetings, right? The pressure to speak
Yeah,
and the pressure to stay silent, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And how people who are silent are perceived, and how that's shifting, and how people who are also speaking a lot are perceived, right? Now,
Right.
so coming, and I, because it's so closely tied with it, right? What are the benefits of getting comfortable with the silence, right? A lot of the time, like you said, because we're not comfortable with the silence, we often force ourselves to interject, right,
Yeah,
with
yeah,
not
yeah.
necessarily the best thought out things, and we're just trying to fill in that awkward gap, right? Now that itself is a disadvantage, right, Suman, because we know that you haven't thought that through, right? But tell us a little bit about the benefits of this, being comfortable with silence, not having to fill in all these gaps.
So you know what's interesting when you were in your sent in your question itself, I think there are two things which are itself benefits, right? First is the thought out response,
Right,
because when we are
right.
silent, we are thinking out as to what we're going to say. Because once the words are out, you can't take it back, right? And you don't want to say something you will regret. So that's clearly a benefit. The other benefit is that you appear more powerful. I mean, and we've seen this. Powerful people impress and they intimidate also by saying less. That typically they speak lesser, right? So that's another huge advantage. The other is you read people better because you're listening and observing the other person. And power to read people is a very powerful skill. As a leader, I think it's extremely important. And you also end up listening more because as I keep saying jokingly, you can't speak and listen at the same time. So other things being equal, someone who's speaking less is generally listening more, right? And people will love talking to you. People love talking to people who are listening more, right? So I think those are some of the benefits. And I think it's also a great negotiation tool. So those are some high level benefits which I can think of right away.
That is very, very interesting. And I'm going to come around back to Suman, that test you were talking about. But Prakash, do you want to jump in at this point and add your thoughts about, being comfortable with silence and the benefits?
Basically, this is my first day on this app, and I'm here to learn English. And please forgive me if I speak something wrong in
Not at
English.
all. Please, we're all
No
here to
problem.
learn, Prakash. Go ahead.
Now, you both English is too good, and I'm weak in English, so that's my point. Okay, so coming to the topic, that's, are you comfortable with the silence? So according to me, some people are comfortable and some people are not comfortable. It's depend upon the situation and the person. Because I was also like a person who was comfortable with the silence throughout my college, throughout my schooling, but later I realized that after progressing, we should to speak out to in the public and with anyone, because we can't grow ourselves without speaking. And then after then I have broke my limits and then I started. So I'm also agree with that the comfortableness is also okay, but not to any means, not to any limit. It should be their balance something. So that's my point. Thank you.
Nice, Prakash. And Suman, Prakash brings out the other extreme of it, right? Where, a lot of the times people are so, no, I don't want to use the term introverted, right? But a lot of the time, people seek comfort in the silence also, so much so that their voice remains unheard, right? Suman, that's the other extreme, I guess, of what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, I think so, Prakash. You bring a very good point. And here we are not talking of being silent throughout, right? So let's
Okay.
be very clear. In fact, in most of my leadership workshops, I keep telling people that, we
Okay,
need
then
to
sorry
speak
for
up.
that, because according to the line, I thought it is silent for the throughout. So
No, no, that's
that,
fine. That's fine. It's a perfectly valid question. I'm just giving my response. I think it's very important to speak up,
yeah.
as you rightly said. So it doesn't mean that we're silent all the time, right? Uh, Definitely. I mean, that's definitely a huge. And when I ask people as to why they're
Huge
silent, many
loss.
people will say, I'm listening. But I'm saying it's okay to listen. But what people fail to realize is when you speak, you're also signaling to people that you're confident, you're able to step out of your comfort zone. So, all those other things, which is why I think it's very important to speak up.
And sorry to disturb, sorry to interrupt. Like if a person speaks, so we know, we get to know about the person, how they behave and how they talk and how their mentality there. So it is good to speak out, right?
Absolutely. I fully agree with you.
Yeah. So this is good.
Thanks, Prakash. Badal, do you want to also jump in? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I want to talk about about silence. According to me, silence is very important, and silence plays an important role in our society. I am working in working in a shop. I am a shop assistant in supermarket. So I think silence is a very important in job, and very important to think about something in silence. So according to me, in my job also silence is a very important. Without silence or without focus in my work, it is not possible to do my work in a constructive way.
Thanks, Badal. That is very, very interesting. And hi, Dr. Amita, you jumped in. Do you wanna,
Yes, Divya. Hi. Good evening, everyone. I just joined right now. Can anybody fill me in? What exactly are we
Yeah,
talking about
so
here?
we're talking about whether we're comfortable with silence, right? And how it's very important that during a conversation that, it's also important to not have to fill in all the gaps, right? Silence has its own role to play in a conversation. Like Suman said, it means you're listening. It means, it means that you're processing some of the information, and it means that any response that you have time to think over it, right? So some of the benefits of being comfortable with silence. So we would also talk about personal experiences where, I was saying that I always tend to fill in what I perceive as awkward gaps in conversation, right? By jumping in and having to say something. And Suman, that brings us to this point of even in circles. Just let's take our circles for example, right? There are
Okay.
there are places where the speaker says something, and then
Yeah.
there is silence, or a listener asks a question, or another speaker asks a question, right? And then there is that pin drop silence, right, where either people
Yeah.
are processing, or there's not that flow in the conversation. So what happens
Yeah.
then, according to you?
Yeah,
So that's
okay.
a
Good
very
topic. Very relevant. Yes, Suman, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for joining. So I think that's a very interesting point. And we have this urge to jump in, and I think we have to control the urge. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say in a workshop, if I ask, hey, does anyone have a question? And I'm sure this is true in your circles as well, right? Let's say the speaker asks, does anyone have a question? What happens is there is silence on the other side. And then because there is silence, we tend to fill in, we tend to jump. But all that's required sometimes is to nudge a little bit. Just say, hey, what's on your mind? What are you thinking? And suddenly, and I'm talking in my workshops, what happens is suddenly one hand goes up, and then another, and then another. It's quite amazing. And I've often wondered why. I think it takes time for people to open up, because opening up requires vulnerability. It's about stepping out of your comfort zone. Those things don't happen automatically. But I think the biggest thing is to resist the urge to jump in. I was talking about the listening quiz. So one of the questions in that quiz is also this, that if the other person is struggling to explain something, I jump in with my own suggestions, right? Which is kind of similar. And quite often people say, yeah, that's true. And I think it's again got to do with lot to do with being comfortable with silence. So I think that's a very good point you bring out. I think we have to somehow resist the urge to be quiet. I mean, resist the urge to speak and be quiet.
Yes, all are very valid points we are making here. I think there are two aspects to it. See, silence is, when we are silent, sometimes we are processing. But sometimes we are silent at the wrong time, where we are supposed to speak, then we are silent, and that can have repercussions. Because if you cannot come out and as Suman is pointing out, that if people take time to trust someone and to speak up. And there is another thing, people are generally scared of speaking in public. It's a public speaking kind of the confidence which we require in speaking in public. So that is also
Correct.
missing in people. And that what we call soft skills.
Yeah.
Sometimes we are hesitant, but all this can have repercussions. So you should know when to be silent, when to process, and you should know exactly when to speak. And I think there has to be a balance between that. And if you have that balance, things will work out in your favor. Otherwise, what happens is that if you're silent at the wrong time, you fail to put your point of view. Either it can be in a workplace or in a relationship, the things can be taken for granted, and then you can end up in the place where you don't want to be. That's what I wanted to add.
No, definitely, Dr. Amita, that's a good point you're bringing up. And
Good
why I
point.
find these topics very fascinating is, they sound so simplistic. When we say we need to know when to speak and when to listen, when to process, when to speak up. It's again, we're simplifying it, but we all know that it's much easier said than done.
Yes, I agree. These are not that simple as they may sound. But then this is
Exactly.
a kind of a yes. But this is a kind of a, I think the practice. It requires practice. It requires a little bit of maturity. Because the urge to speak is so much sometimes that we forget that what we are speaking might actually hurt someone, and there has to be some kind of filter in what we are speaking also. So that is why. Are you comfortable with silence? And so I think the thing which I want to add is that there is the comfort in the silence, and then you should process whatever the other person is saying, and then respond instead of reacting. So that urge to speak at once can actually destroy things, for you. So be comfortable in silence, process things.
So,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Amita, lovely point. It kind of resonates so well, Suman, with what we were talking about in an earlier circle about kind of not being reactive, right? But being responsive and not reactive. I think
Absolutely.
it ties together so beautifully with that, right? And
Absolutely.
right. So coming back to being comfortable with silence, and I love that some of the, like you said, the simplistic stuff about, let's talk about, even now we've been talking about speaker and listener, right? Now in the word speaker and listener itself, there is this whole role of what they're supposed to be doing, right? And
Yeah.
it kind of also ties back to the point Prakash was making, that just because you're listening to something doesn't mean that you only are listening or you have to stay quiet all the time, right? There's a lot of ways in which you can participate in a conversation while being a listener and while actively listening to what the other person is saying, right, Suman?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
have anything to share on that before I...
Yeah. So I think we have been talking more from the point of view of the speaker.
Correct.
But let's say I'm the listener, right? Now, what does it mean about embracing silence? I think we talked to one end of the spectrum where we are not speaking at all, right? Which is definitely not desirable. We need to speak up. But on the other hand, what happens is, let's say I'm listening and you're speaking, right? And you're saying something, and suddenly, I have this urge to say something, right? Maybe I don't agree with what you're saying. So we tend to jump in immediately. I was talking about this quiz. I think one of the questions is I interrupt people. And often a lot of us interrupt people. And I think that goes to what we were talking earlier, right? Because our speaking and processing speeds are very different, right? We speak at about 150 to 200 words a minute, whereas our brain can process 300 to 400 words a minute. So there's idle capacity. So what's happening is while you're speaking, I'm also processing, I'm crafting a response while you're speaking. That's the problem with that, is that after a while I'm not listening to you because I'm only kind of caught up in what I'm going to say next, right? And this again goes to mindfulness, which we have talked of quite a bit. We need to calm our mind, and but at the same time, let's say you're speaking and I want to say something, because I know that now this is playing in my head. There's no point in you carrying on speaking, right, without me interrupting you, because then I've actually switched off. So then a nice way would be to butt in and say, I might tell you, hey, Zed, can I say something, or let me see if I've got that right, and paraphrase what you're saying. Essentially, I am interrupting in a way, but I'm also asking for permission. And I think that's a very powerful way to do this, because what that does
Yeah.
is it actually changes the role, and then as a speaker that, okay, now Suman is going to speak, right? Simple thing, but I think most of us forget, which is to ask for permission.
Yeah, that's a lovely point. Prakash, did I hear you speak? Do you want to come?
I want to add one more point that our listeners are a good observer. That is a fact, a psychological fact. Who like to listen more, so they observing the things very deeply, and they're doing very things analyzing. They analyzing things very deeply, and in that way they are might be they are good to the person who are speaker. Sometimes this I observed in my when I was in the class. So the person or the student who speaks and who talk very much with the teacher, but they are not performing good at the result. But the student who are observing, they couldn't speak. I mean, they're not active in not active in sorry. I mean, they're not talkative with the teachers. So, but their result is good. Why? Because they are observing and they listening very carefully. So the listening is important. So that I wanted to add. So that's
Definitely, I think there's no dispute there. I think definitely listening is very important.
yeah, because this is topic is silence, so that's why I added this. And I want to ask one more thing: how could I correct my English? Because I am here to learn English, and
Prakash, there's
Well,
lots of
Prakash,
so
no, I
you both
think
are.
I was just about to say that your English is fine.
yeah.
Yeah, so you don't worry so much about the language, about the English. I think it's important to articulate, and I like the way you are articulating the questions. It's not like that you are all over the place, so which is really good. So I would think focus more on being very precise and very crisp in what you're trying to say, as opposed to the language itself.
Okay, basically, I make mistakes in the grammar and framing sentences. That's where I lag. So where I want to know how could I correct it?
So, Prakash, there are a lot, and Suman, if that this is something that I don't know if a lot of people know, but there is a whole community of in Mentza where people, kind of practice and join circles just for spoken English, right? Where they're talking to
Right.
everybody else and trying to, increase their command and grasp of the language. So, in your communities tab, go check out the everyday English community, and you'll see a lot of channels and circles devoted almost entirely to speaking and practicing and speaking English, right? So
Yes,
you should totally check that out.
oh,
But
So
that's
Divya, I'm
good.
sorry to interrupt
Thank you,
because we just have
thank
two
you for
minutes left.
this.
So if there are
yes,
any
come
other
back.
questions, let's take those.
Yes, absolutely. So, Dr. Amita, are you jumping in or should I go?
Yes, Divya, go ahead, please.
So, Suman, one of the other times that we are not comfortable with silence is if we are under any kind of pressure, right? We talked about this whole, and I want to come back to this thing of awkward silence and the way that I phrased it as an awkward silence, right? That itself
Yeah,
is kind of a pressure, right? It's a stressful feeling that I feel. Now, similarly, there could be time pressure, right? There could be, like you just talked about, there's only 2.5 minutes left, right? So in
yeah.
these cases, being comfortable with silence, or, how would you look at in these cases?
Yeah, so and again, what's happening is nowadays all of us are constantly under time pressure, and under time pressure it becomes more difficult to be quiet and silent. So that's a very valid point. And there are different ways of doing it. I think this also goes to time management, right? So if I'm, let's say, you're coming and speaking to me, and I know I just have 5 minutes, and after 4 minutes or 3 minutes I'm getting anxious, that may not be the best way to do it. So maybe I should check with you upfront as to how much time you're going to take. It requires a certain amount of discipline, and you say it's going to take 5 minutes, and then both of us have to be disciplined to end the conversation in 5 minutes. And during that time, I need to be completely kind of focused on what you're saying. I think that presence is very much required, right? And we have to catch ourselves in case our mind is drifting.
Right. Yep, makes total sense. Any other last thoughts, Suman? Last messages for being comfortable with silence before?
Since we talked quite a bit about being silent when we're listening, and this, I just wanted to say one thing. During conversation, we say that don't use filler words, right? Some of us use filler words like yeah, it's not a good thing. But the opposite is true when we're listening. Let's say I'm listening to you. One thing I can do is be completely silent. The other thing is I can keep using filler words by saying, okay, go on. In this case, it's actually better to use filler words because it helps in two ways. One, it helps you to know that I'm connected, and it also helps me to stay mindful, because even though I may be feeling I'm listening intently, but my mind may have drifted. So by using these filler words, actually it helps me to stay connected. So
Thank
that's
you
one
so
thing
much.
I'd like to,
Exactly,
yeah,
sir.